about 15 years ago, I wrote a book called Frontier Metropolis, which attempted to corner every known image pre-photographic of Detroit. And in the course of working on that project, beginning my research, looking for secondary sources on the history of early Detroit, that is before the middle of the 19th century, found the cupboard to be virtually bare. There had been recent work done in the 1940s and the late 1950s. Before that, people like Clarence Burton, early in the 20th century, had done a lot of collecting and a lot of writing about early Detroit. But it was very difficult to find much else that dealt with that particular topic. It puzzled me because 18th century, early 19th century Detroit is a fascinating place, has all kinds of possibilities for research, and I would hope that that is going to improve. And in fact, today there is a group of younger scholars, quite a number of them, who are working on early Detroit. And at the vanguard of that group is our speaker today, Katie Cangany. We'd like to welcome her to the Clements Library. Many of you know her from her time at Michigan, where she earned her doctorate in 2009. Today, she is Associate Professor of History at Notre Dame University. She's the author of Frontier Seaport, a book about Detroit's transformation into an Atlantic Entrepot. It used the Clements resources very heavily, along with a lot of other repositories, and even more important, there are copies of the book in the back if anyone would care to purchase one and take it along. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Katie and introduce you all to a little more of early Detroit.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me in the back? Good. I am just delighted to be here. This, for me, is coming home. So thank you to Kevin Graffinino for the invitation to be here. Thank you for Brian Dunnigan, who is the real expert in the room on this subject matter, and it is a privilege to sit at your feet. As he mentioned, I was a doctoral student in the University of Michigan's History Department from 2002 to 2009. And 3 of my mentors are here today. Well, 2 are here and 1 is on the way. And that's to say Professors David Hancock, Sue Jester, and Mary Kelly, who set superior examples for their students. And whatever I hope to achieve on the podium, in the classroom, in the field, is because of them. So thank you to the 3 of you. I'm going to tell you a story today about one of colonial North America's seaports. We're going to talk about its economy, we're going to talk about its culture, and we're going to talk about its politics. And there will be times that you will think we are talking about Boston. There will be times you will think we are talking about New York. There will be times you're not sure where it is we're talking about. You already know the punchline here. The colonial seaport under investigation is not Boston, not New York, but Detroit. This material comes from my recent book, Frontier Seaport, and that's the argument right there in the title. Despite being 600 miles from the eastern seaboard, that's the frontier part, Detroit functioned just like any other entrepot in the Atlantic world. That's the seaport part. That argument sounds pretty straightforward, but actually it cuts against more than a century of scholarship about Detroit, which we have all unknowingly imbibed. If I ask you to imagine for a moment what Detroit looked like in, let's say, 1766, so 250 years ago, most of you would probably envision something like this artist's rendering of Detroit's foundational period. Until Michigan attained statehood in 1837, this traditional view goes, this is more or less what early Detroit supposedly looked like. A small outpost whose native and French inhabitants were concerned only with participating in the fur trade. There is some truth to that interpretation, which we'll talk about, but what I'd like to do is to show you how that interpretation is only part of the story, that the isolated fur trade station that Detroit started out being in 1701 didn't last very long, and that actually its success in being that isolated fur trade station led directly to its development into an Atlantic world seaport. I'm not suggesting that this development happened all at once. In fact, I'm going to demonstrate the opposite. Detroit's engagement with the Atlantic world was asynchronous. Economically and culturally, Detroit was very quickly absorbed into the Atlantic world, and that process began as soon as Detroit was founded, although it retained something of its frontier economy and culture even as that was happening. By contrast, geographically and politically, Detroit remained thoroughly on the fringes of the Atlantic world, even after Michigan attained statehood. And through the mid-19th century, Detroit continued to exhibit this mixed identity, both frontier and Atlantic, and that mixed identity hindered it from becoming a thoroughly American metropolis. So one of the prevailing myths that we tell ourselves about early Detroit is that the fur trade was its only economy. The fur trade was Detroit's foundational economy, yes, but not its only economy. The history of the fur trade goes something like this. In the 17th and 18th centuries, fur hats, and especially beaver hats, were all the rage in Europe, and you can see a couple of examples here in this artist's rendering. But because Europe had nearly exhausted its own supply of fur-bearing animals, Europeans were forced to turn elsewhere, to North America, to find a new supply. And by the late 17th century, that supply could be found in the Great Lakes region. And not just beaver, although that was the most valuable, but also rabbit, raccoon, fox, squirrel, deer, bear, and mink. The French explorer Cadillac knew all about that supply, and he also knew that France was in competition with England for it. And he also knew that the most efficient way to get a hold of it was to enlist native help. After all, the local Odawas, Ojibways, Potawatomis, and Hurons had the best knowledge of the land, and they had the communities, resources, and networks to obtain and transport the furs far more easily and efficiently than the French ever could. All of this prompted Cadillac in 1701 to found a new colony in which French and various native populations would live and work cheek by jowl with one another, collecting furs and skins and then shipping them back to France. He called this new colony Detroit, Détroit in French, meaning the Strait, and it refers to this narrow waterway here which connects Lakes Erie and Huron up here via Lake St. Clair. So here's a kind of modern map here to sort of give you a sense of what we're talking about, this tiny little strait. Why did he put it here? Location, location, location. In the heart of the Great Lakes, Detroit was accessible, positioned on trade routes that led to the Atlantic Ocean, to the interior of the Midwest, and even to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. We tend to imagine the fur trade as having been a pretty insular business, but in fact, it was nearer to having been a global enterprise. During the French period, furs and skins collected and packaged at Detroit were loaded into canoes and then transported via rivers and lakes to Montreal or to Quebec City, where they were then unpacked, reloaded into ships, and then taken across the Atlantic Ocean to France. Some of those furs and skins remained in France, where they were then made up into hats and gloves and other articles, and then either sold locally or shipped back to the North American colonies. But the other portion of those raw skins and furs was shipped further east or south to Germany, Poland, Switzerland, Italy, Spain, Russia, and even China. So note that what I've got up on the screen for you here does not depict actual trade routes, but just to give you a sense of the scale of this undertaking. So just by virtue of having been the point of origin of that vast trade, Detroit contributed to an astonishing number of world markets. In exchange for its furs and skins, Detroit area residents received goods from most of those same markets. Some were meant specifically to compensate native peoples, glass trade beads from Venice, European frying pans and kettles, knives, guns and ammunition, coarse textiles, silver jewelry, and even vermilion from China. Vermilion is that rich red pigment that native peoples often painted themselves with. So in this 1777 cartouche done by William Faden, we see a typical transaction of the fur trade. The Odawa man on the right here has brought his furs and skins for trade, and the British merchant on the left with his two assistants here have brought their trunks and barrels of goods to negotiate. So this kind of merchandise is exactly what we'd expect to find in this long-standing interpretation of early Detroit. But because of the fur trade's global nature and because of Detroit's remarkable financial success in it, after 1740, Detroiters also had access to a wide range of non-fur trade or transnational goods: spices, fine textiles, tea, furniture, books, and kitchen and dining implements, including Wedgwood and Chinese export porcelain. So at the same time that Detroit was an entrepot for the fur trade, it was also an entrepot for the same types of transnational goods circulating all over the Atlantic world. This discovery is a surprise. This is not the kind of merchandise we expected to find on Detroit shop shelves, and yet it was pervasive and enormously popular. So how did this development occur? By the mid-18th century, Detroit was the single most important collection center for the fur trade in North America. By the time the British took over control of it in 1760, the settlement was exporting a staggering 100,000 New York pounds worth of furs each year. And let me say a quick word about currency here. In this era, the British colonies experienced a chronic currency shortage. To remedy it, many of the colonies printed their own money, so Detroit business was often conducted using New York pounds. A New York pound was generally worth about 40% of a pound sterling, so each year then, Detroit was exporting about 40,000 pounds sterling worth of furs. That's difficult to represent in today's money, but so that you can get a sense for the feel of it. The average British North American colonist's annual income in this period was about 25 New York pounds. So we're talking about an industry whose exports were valued at 4,000 times the average colonist's income. In short, the fur trade was big business, but transnational merchandise was even bigger business. Shops designed to hawk it sprang up like mushrooms. In 1740, Detroit possessed just one shop. By 1778, there were 20. And by 1836, the year before Michigan was admitted to statehood, on Jefferson Avenue, the main thoroughfare in Detroit, every single lot housed some kind of retail venture. At the same time that Detroit was exporting 100,000 New York pounds worth of furs each year, it was importing 5 times that amount of merchandise. And it does not take an economist to tell you that is no way to balance the checkbook. Colonial Detroiters were chronically in debt. The town's 1770 population was about 4,500 people, 2,500 Indians and 2,000 colonists. So if we divide that 500,000 pound figure by 4,500 people, each Detroiter then consumed 111 New York pounds worth of imported goods each year, more than 4 times the average colonist's annual income. Now certainly, this consumption rate is artificially high. That 500,000 pound figure likely included merchandise that merely passed through Detroit to points further in the interior. So we might easily knock it down to 50 or even 25 New York pounds per person per year. But compared to what the average colonist was consuming on the eastern seaboard in imported goods each year, about 3 New York pounds, this amount for Detroit per person is staggering. Everybody in Detroit consumed transnational merchandise. Everybody. Native peoples did, people of African descent did, the French did, the British did. I could give you a million different examples here, but let me just give you one, albeit a somewhat outrageous example. In the summer of 1792, that's in the twilight of British rule, a fur trade clerk by the name of John Asquith relocated to colonial Detroit. We know very little about him. He came from Montreal. He left behind a daughter named Fanny. He took a job with one of the biggest fur trading houses in Detroit, and he was unhappy in his new home. In fact, his only surviving letter calls Detroit the, quote, most miserable place in all Canada, end quote. Most significantly, when he arrived in 1792, he was penniless. We might never really have known very much about John Asquith at all, except for 2 things. During his time in Detroit, he was an inexhaustible shopper. And in 1795, he died intestate. When John Asquith died, most of his personal effects, all of which he had purchased in Detroit, remained unpaid for. And so those possessions were itemized, appraised, and sold at public auction to reimburse his countless creditors. Up on the screen, you can see part of that inventory. And what he was able to accumulate in 3 years is astonishing. 3 tea kettles, a Dutch oven, several sets of cups and saucers, 12 Wedgwood plates, a microscope, cases of mathematical and scientific instruments, assorted pieces of furniture, a looking glass, spectacles, 2 violins and strings, 2 globes, a collection of maps. He owned 150 books, dictionaries, treatises on mathematics, navigation, law, history, geography, the military, music, texts in foreign languages. But most impressive was his extensive wardrobe. 30 vests, a dozen shirts, 10 cravats, 15 coats, and an astonishing 38 pairs of breeches and trousers. At auction, these goods collectively fetched 200 New York pounds, the same amount, incidentally, that was collected for his entire house and lot. That's a lot of personal property. Asquith had been able to pay for almost none of these things by the time he died in 1795, but through generous extensions of credit from local merchants, he had been able to acquire all of them, right? I know, shades of the 21st century. Moreover, with the exception of the microscope and the other scientific instruments, these were not specially ordered goods. These things were regularly stocked on merchants' shop shelves. Asquith may have purchased more than the average consumer, but the types of goods that he bought, in general, were not unusual at all. His purchases are startling to us. They're not what we assume existed in this frontier town 600 miles from the coast. And we are not alone in these assumptions. Even 18th century visitors to Detroit were taken aback by its commercial situation. Irish traveler Isaac Weld Jr. discovered in the fall of 1796 that Detroit controlled a, quote, very considerable trade. The stores and shops in the town are well furnished, and you may buy fine cloth, linen, etc., and every article of wearing apparel as good in their kind and nearly on as reasonable terms as you can purchase them from New York or Philadelphia. The inhabitants are well supplied with provisions of every description. Weld also gives us an idea of what Detroiters were wearing in 1796. Fine cloth, linen, etc., the same articles of wearing apparel you could find in New York or Philadelphia. That's not what we tend to imagine early Detroiters to have been wearing. We tend to think they looked something like this. We all know this Western ensemble, right? The fringed leather hunting shirt, the leather pants, the coonskin hat, the rifle. There is some truth to this depiction. Hunting shirts, albeit usually made of cotton or linen, not leather, were for sale in Detroit's shops, and French fur traders, native men, and soldiers, like this backwoodsman rifleman that you see pictured here, all wore them. And although full leather pants were not common in the 18th century Great Lakes, men's leather breeches, which were buckled at the knee, could be purchased in town and were well suited for things like horseback riding or manual labor. It was much more typical for colonial Detroiters to dress like this. This is a watercolor painted by an anonymous German artist around 1780, and it features 2 registers of figures, so Indians, 5 men and 2 women, up on the top here, and then French habitants, 4 men and 2 women on the bottom register. So let's begin by looking at the top register of figures. These native peoples wear indigenous elements of dress, so we see, for example, leggings and also headdresses of single feathers, but some of them also wear elements of European dress. We've got a wide-brimmed black hat here, European bodices on the 2 women on the right. They also wear elements of French-Canadian dress, including the women's shin-length skirts, and you can see this woman has paired it with leggings and moccasins. So those same rudiments of colonial clothing are also worn by some of the French habitants on the lower register. So we've got the same wide-brimmed black hat here. We've got the same kinds of frock coats on the men. We've got also a French-Canadian coat called a capote. It's got a hood on it here. And also notice that the men are wearing knee breeches with silk stockings. There are also native elements of dress here. Here's a French-Canadian man who's wearing leggings. We've got another man who's wearing moccasins with snowshoes over here. So the number and types of garments captured in the watercolor make it clear that frontier peoples could easily have worn, head to toe, the attire of one particular cultural group. The fact that they mixed them and wore them in these untraditional combinations, then, is thus a matter of taste and preference, revealing this popular local custom of cultural hybridity. Well-to-do residents, especially in the British period, often passed on hybridity in favor of imperial stylishness, and visitors to Detroit routinely marked on it. American General Anthony Wayne wrote with some surprise in 1796 that, quote, "Here in the center of the wilderness in the West, you see a number of wealthy and well-informed merchants and gentlemen, and elegant, fashionable, and well-bred women," end quote. 2 decades later, William Darby observed some Detroiters flitting about town in, quote, "habiliments that would suit the walks of New York, Philadelphia, London, or Paris." In 1830, Pierre Salle de la Terrière admired Detroit's church clothes. On the Sunday, he wrote, "They are gaily attired, chiefly after the English fashion, with only this difference. Where the English wears one, the Canadian girl wears a dozen colors." Where did Detroiters' garments come from? Ready-made clothes were rare in this place. Most local merchants stocked only raw textiles from which locals could purchase yardage to be made up into clothing, either made at home or then contracted out to local seamstresses and tailors. So think back now to John Asquith's 1795 estate inventory. 30 vests, a dozen shirts, 10 cravats, 15 coats, 38 pairs of breeches and trousers. Most of those garments would have been made locally from imported cloth. Contemporary outsiders were often surprised to discover that Detroiters not only paid attention to what was deemed fashionable in the European metropoles, but also were able to mimic those styles not too long afterward. They were surprised about this, but we should not be. The fur trade's global nature and Detroiters' thirst for transnational merchandise made for an eager market for fashion. How did Detroiters receive their fashion news? One source was imported Parisian prints. In 1831, Gustave de Beaumont stumbled upon something like these, a drawing of stylish Parisian women, tacked up in a Detroit dressmaker's shop, the same year it had been published in Paris. The well-informed proprietor, Madame de Modero, both kept up on what was fashionable in France and then advertised it to her clients, who would have been anxious for her to keep them in style too. Detroiters also received their fashion news from those living in the East. Archange Askin Meredith, who moved to England on the occasion of her marriage, wrote regularly to her family back in Detroit. To her younger sisters Adelaide, Thérèse, and Ellen, whom she knew to be, quote, interested in the fashion, end quote, she would write in detail of clothing and hairstyles, exhorting her siblings to, quote, pay attention. In 1795, she wrote, "I noticed that all the ladies are wearing their skirts almost under the arms so as to raise the waistline. Sashes are about the width of a narrow collar and are fastened at the back with a buckle. The hair is curled, hanging at the back and arranged in small curls in the front, with a piece of ribbon or a band of muslin around the head. Even a thin lawn handkerchief arranged for a headdress with a white feather in it is fashionable. It is very fashionable in the best society, so there is no need of going to great expense about dressing the hair. Be so good, my dear mother, as to tell my dear sister Thérèse that this part of my letter is for her, and how she is to dress in style for the next Detroit ball." The fashion reports that Archange Askin Meredith imparted to her younger sisters could be imitated and further disseminated by their friends, trickling through Detroit's various social circles. But there was another effect. Meredith was well aware that her father, Detroit merchant John Askin, was also reading them. In January 1798, before a lengthy narrative on the latest hairstyles, hats, and dresses, she apologized, quote, "I hope my dear father will excuse my inserting a few fashions in this letter for the perusal of Adelaide, who I dare say is pleased with the description of dress," end quote. Meredith's reports contained simple directives that her father could use then to make more informed decisions about what to order from his Montreal suppliers. So in the winter of 1799, she advised, quote, "Handkerchiefs are also in vogue, small earrings and necklaces, narrow girdles, narrow bracelets are now in fashion, silk gloves of any color, and very long to come high up on the arm." In the autumn of 1794, she noted that, quote, hats are surprisingly large. The way to trim them is with a buckle. In the same letter, she added, quote, there is nothing so vulgar as to see silk stockings the least bit blue. They must be white as snow. For the residents with the means and the inclination, clothes were not mere necessities, but also statements of fashion and affluence. Fashionable dress made up from imported cloth was one badge that Detroiters wore to signal both their status as ladies and gentlemen and also their commercial partnership with and attachment to empire. This is not to say, of course, that every Detroiter dressed in finery. We've seen examples of simple frontier-inspired clothing, but nor were Detroiters dressing like Davy Crockett. As one would expect, their clothes exhibited a range of stylishness and cultural inspirations, proportionate or disproportionate, in John Asquith's case, to their purposes and their owners' incomes. So far, I've tried to give you a sense of early Detroiters' ties to the Atlantic world, their parity with other citizens of the Atlantic. And we saw this kind of parity in the kinds of commerce they were participating in, the kinds of goods that they were purchasing, and the types of clothing that they were wearing. What I'd now like to do is the reverse, to show you some of the ways that early Detroiters tried to remain distinctive, separate from the Atlantic world. Colonial Detroiters understood that the fur trade was the settlement's livelihood. But they also understood how Atlantic world commerce worked. Everyone strove to produce merchandise that other people wanted. And so, colonial Detroiters developed their own value-added commodity that capitalized on their frontier status and made use of the raw materials that they already possessed. And that commodity was moccasins. Native peoples in Michigan had been wearing moccasins for centuries, if not millennia, before Detroit was founded in 1701. But the minute Europeans came on the scene, they too began wearing them. Why? Because moccasins were a thoroughly practical footwear. They were durable, they dried quickly after being wet, they were easy to procure and to make, and they provided their wearers with greater sure-footedness. In a landscape as wet, muddy, snowy, and rough as 18th century Detroit was, moccasins beat European heeled shoes hands down. From 1701 on, everyone who lived in Detroit wore moccasins. Scottish and German traders, French farmers, gardeners, merchants, school teachers, women who owned their own property, indentured servants, tailors, attorneys, carpenters and other tradesmen, black and native slaves, clerks, and sailors. Everybody. After the British arrived in Detroit in 1760, local merchants then began stocking moccasins in their shops. The fabricators, surprisingly, do not seem to have been native women, the people who produced them in native communities. Instead, they were produced within white households, and without exception, the people who were compensated for making them were white men. So that's step one. Here's step two. British merchant John Askin realized that many of the town's unsold raw skins could be offloaded if they were transformed into a value-added commodity that customers wanted. So in 1777, he opened what would be the first of the town's 3 tanneries. He partnered with local shoemakers to turn the excess raw skins into moccasins he could then sell in his store. From January 1787 to March 1788, Askin's Tanning and Company supplied 182 pairs of moccasins to Askin's shop, averaging more than 12 pairs a month. Tanning and Company was successful enough to produce stiff competition in the form of a rival tannery opened by Detroit merchant James Henry, called the Point Industry Tannery. And you can see part of the inventory book here up on the slide. And Point Industry opened in 1790. Together, these two were turning out 1,100 hides a year, many of which were being turned into moccasins. In the space of 20 years, Detroit's merchants began to use their leather manufactories to conduct all facets of moccasin production, from the acquisition and tanning of raw skins to the stitching of the shoes and then their preparation for sale. In consequence, the process of manufacturing these shoes and the shoes themselves became hybridized, a blend of old techniques and new conventions. The tannery laborers, likely a mix of native and non-native peoples, cured native and white-supplied skins in European-style chemical tanning vats. They cut the skins with European scissors to fit native patterns, often supplementing the forms with European-style tongue pieces and soles. They then stitched the leather pieces with European needles and thread, and then sent the finished shoes to merchant shops for retail to local consumers. So it was a process of fabrication that depended both on native knowledge and technique, and also European manufacturing methods and production structures. And it allowed for this small imperial settlement of relatively little consequence, best known for collecting and packaging furs, to become a minor but still significant manufacturing town. Detroit's moccasins were not worn in Detroit alone. Merchants exported the footwear via the Great Lakes to the eastern seaboard. From 1792 to 1826, moccasin advertisements ran in newspapers in every single state of the Union, including in Massachusetts, where Boston merchant Joseph Thayer could proclaim with certainty in 1823 to carry, quote, moccasins of every kind and style in which they can be found. The fashion of moccasins caught on, making the jump across the Atlantic at about the same time. The May 1828 issue of Bell's Court and Fashionable magazine reported that that year, stylish women in London were wearing Indian moccasins drawn over the dress shoe to keep out the spring chill. Certainly not all of the moccasins sold on the East Coast and beyond had been fabricated in Detroit, but the quantities of shoes that Detroit's merchant houses and tanneries produced suggest that a sizable portion was. So far, I've highlighted two important commercial developments in early Detroit that occurred after 1740, the boom in transnational merchandise and the dawn of Atlantic world-style manufacturing, as evidenced by moccasins. But just because Detroiters craved economic and cultural incorporation into the Atlantic world did not mean that they were equally enthusiastic about political incorporation. In fact, when the U.S. government arrived in Detroit in 1796, Detroiters were not happy to become American citizens. And just so I don't perpetuate a myth myself, this is not a painting of Detroit that you see before you. Although George Washington was President of the United States in 1796, he did not come to Detroit that year to welcome Michigan into the American fold. Rather, this is a painting commemorating Washington's first inauguration in 1789. But you get the drift here. Parades, banners, Native peoples enthusiastically clapping, none of that happened in Detroit in 1796. If Detroiters took any lesson away from their experiences in the colonial period, it was that imperial powers came and went. In 1796, Detroit saw its third regime change, and there were still two more to come. During the War of 1812, Detroit would return briefly to British control before being restored to American ownership in 1813. Although the U.S. government would prove substantially closer geographically to Detroit than the British or French governments had been, Detroiters still expected to have a similar relationship with the United States as they had had with their previous occupiers, which is to say, hands off. Although France and Britain had been eager to regulate the fur trade, they cared little about managing the day-to-day running of the town. So the result was that in the French and British periods, Detroit, like many frontier settlements, had a remarkable degree of autonomy. And so Detroiters greeted the arrival of the U.S. government in 1796, much as they had the British in 1760. Some with annoyance, some with indifference, but most with the confidence born of experience that life would continue more or less apace. They would be proved dead wrong. We could talk about any number of ways that life in Detroit changed after 1796, and just as many ways that longstanding residents responded negatively to those changes. But I'd like to focus on just one response today in keeping with our investigation into Detroit's economy, and that is the rise of smuggling. Let's begin by talking about trade routes. The channels of legal commerce within 18th century Great Lakes Basin settlements traced the region's waterways. It's the easiest, fastest, cheapest, and often most direct way to move goods, animals, and people. From 1701 to 1796, Detroit's chief trading partners were three settlements accessible via the Detroit River: Quebec, Montreal, and what's now known as Windsor on the south side of the Detroit River. Until 1796, these three trading partners were also of the same empires as Detroit, whether French or after 1760, British. But when Detroit became an American holding in 1796, the Detroit River became, for the first time, an international boundary, separating the town from British Canada. Suddenly, its primary trading partners were foreign. The timing of the boundary's creation coincided with the U.S. government's increased enforcement of the Revenue Act of 1789, which both protected domestic trade and outlined the first schedule of import duties, and these were crucial to the new government's show of solvency and stability. To facilitate the tariffs collection, in 1790, Congress created the Revenue Service, which was a fleet of vessels designed to prevent smuggling along the eastern seaboard. 10 years later, in 1800, the federal government, desperate for more revenue, applied these developments to Detroit, and that year, Detroit got its first customs collector. His principal responsibility was to enforce and collect tariffs on Canadian imports. The consequences of this development were considerable. The tariffs made the Canadian goods on which Detroiters depended daily more financially and bureaucratically prohibitive. Detroit merchant James Henry, owner of the Point Industry Tannery, was terrified of bankruptcy, and he vowed to order no more goods from his suppliers in Montreal. Recognizing that he would have to forge new business relationships with New York dealers, he complained bitterly that, quote, the course of trade must be changed. Another merchant in town, John Askin, noticed an immediate decline in local commerce. Ruin, he declared, Detroit is not far from you. In fact, Askin would move permanently to the Canadian side of the river in 1802. In response to these new tariffs, a new type of illicit trade began to flourish along the Detroit River, the smuggling of staple goods. The goods in question were the same ones that Detroit had shipped to and received from its Canadian partners before 1800: flour, pork, apples, other kinds of produce, and so on. So what we see in the introduction of staple smuggling is an attempt to preserve the trading practices that had sustained this community for a century. The local commercial sector orchestrated and assisted in many of these new kinds of illegal exchanges. But more troubling from the customs collector's standpoint was common people's involvement, whose connections and behavior were harder to ascertain and to monitor. Collector William Woodbridge complained to the U.S. Treasury in 1822, quote, this state of things almost every day involves the collector in difficulty. Shall he search every old market woman's pocket and cause suit to be instituted in every case where a pair of fowls, a dozen eggs, or a bunch of onions may have been illegally introduced? The difficulty of apprehending and prosecuting staple smuggling is borne out by Michigan's territorial court records. Of all the illegal transactions undoubtedly occurring daily after 1800, only 25 cases of smuggling had been prosecuted by 1837, less than one per year. Thus, the preponderance of Detroit smuggling cases were not discovered, let alone foiled or prosecuted, and thus they have no documentation. But thanks to the frustrated collectors' furious writings on the subject, we know what they surmised about how these operations worked. First, they took advantage of loopholes in maritime and revenue law. For example, the 1792 and 93 Registering and Coasting Acts required all American vessels of at least 5 tons burden that conducted international trade to be registered. This was a law meant expressly for ocean-going commerce. By inference, vessels weighing fewer than 5 tons, the majority of Great Lakes vessels, like these pictured here, were not required to be registered or licensed, nor were they bound to have a manifest or cargo list on board. So the lion's share of contraband trade around Detroit was thus conducted with small craft. And on a span as narrow as the Detroit River is, a mile wide at most, the government stood almost no chance of catching them. There were other loopholes. U.S. revenue law, again designed with the Atlantic Ocean in mind, assumed the use of watercraft to facilitate international trade. But in the winter, when the Detroit River froze, local smugglers had a seasonal and unregulated range of vehicles at their disposal. During the winter of 1825-26, customs collector William Woodbridge, who you see down there in the bottom left, caught Detroiters smuggling goods into Canada in sleds and sleighs, pulling them across the ice under cover of darkness. Because there was no law specifically enumerating winter vehicles among those means of transportation appropriate for conducting international trade or liable to the relevant duties, Woodbridge had no grounds to stop them. U.S. Treasury Comptroller Joseph Anderson could only sympathize with the befuddled collector about what he termed, quote, the peculiar circumstances of your district. William Woodbridge was all too aware of those peculiar circumstances. They were precisely what had allowed the smuggling of staples to develop. He explained, one of the peculiar features of the commerce of our lake border is that 99/100ths of all the articles illegally imported into it have been smuggled in detail, end quote, not in bulk. Why, he asked, would contraband traders foolishly traffic in large quantities and risk apprehension when they could so easily separate their parcels among canoes and other small vessels, not to mention winter vehicles, which were not bound to carry papers, which were well equipped to conceal their ports of call, and which spread out the risk of full seizure? Certainly, staple smuggling was established to defy the law, but the trade routes and the routines that comprised it were far older than the legal codes or their enforcers, making it not simply an act of insubordination, but instead an attempt to preserve and uphold the area's economic and cultural habits that were not to be bound by subsequent nations or their borders. Kin groups, businesses, and social networks all spanned the Detroit River, and before 1796 moved freely between sides, using the river as a bridge, not a boundary. In local estimation, then, staple smuggling was not, in fact, smuggling at all. It was simply the legally unrecognized continuance of traditional trans-river commercial practices, which predated the arrival of customs collectors and every other American in town. So now let's put all four of our revised snapshots of Detroit together. Its bifurcated economy, which is to say the fur trade and the retailing of transnational merchandise, its sartorial diversity, native, colonial, and Atlantic fashion, the manufacturing of moccasins, a native technology that was manufactured and sold through European production, distribution, and marketing techniques, and finally the rise of staple smuggling, that local economic resistance to an Atlantic world political development. Together, they give us the complexities and paradoxes of a frontier seaport. This mixed identity, once Western and Eastern, only existed because of colonialism, because of the particular geography of landscape and empire. That geography began to change in the mid-19th century, both physically and imperially. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 made it easier for white immigrants to the east to pour into Michigan, making the settlement less native, less French, less British, and more American. The new buildings and suburbs that arose after 1825 were laid out and built by those new residents in an American style. More broadly, the United States government kept Detroit on a shorter lead than previous colonizing powers had, and that project got underway beginning in 1800 with Detroit's first customs collector, and continued through Michigan's statehood in 1837 and beyond. Those developments were still far off and unanticipated when Detroit's British Lieutenant Governor, Henry Hamilton, surveyed this frontier seaport in the late summer of 1776. Inspired by Detroit's possibilities, even as the American Revolution was beginning to rage in the East, even as he worried about Virginians and their native allies attacking Detroit, he observed that, quote, the appearance of the settlement is very smiling. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the great lecture, Professor. You had a slide up there that showed that the population early on was actually more Native American than it was French. Could you tell us, if you know, what the relations were like between these two races, and how was it that a population that was about 60% Indian later became almost like 1%?
Those are great questions. So the first thing I should say is that when the French explorer Cadillac put plans in motion to found Detroit in 1701, his idea was to create one settlement where Native and French people would live and work together on the fur trade. So he sent out word to various Native groups scattered around Michigan and then eventually in Wisconsin, encouraging them to relocate. And slowly but surely, groups came. Odawas came, Ojibways came, Miamis came, Potawatomis came, Hurons came, and so on and so forth. And he envisioned that it was going to be something sort of like a commune. They'd all live together, of course, for French benefit. The reality was they all set up their own Detroits on various sites along the riverbank, and each of those settlements was palisaded and at a good distance from the others. So this idea that he has of multiculturalism, multicultural experiment, makes people very nervous from 1701 on. And so as he invites more tribes to settle in the area, particularly from Wisconsin, this very delicate balance gets upset. And so violence repeatedly breaks out in this community. So once the Wisconsin tribes are evicted and sort of Cadillac's trying to calm everything back down, by that point on, it continues to be a Native majority. And then over time, as these pockets of violence pop up, and then most notably in 1763 with the so-called war called Pontiac's, this 6-month siege of Detroit in 1763, in the wake of that siege, it's a stalemate, Pontiac and his supporters withdrew to Illinois. So that sort of marks the beginning of Native peoples being less visible in town. Not to say they're completely gone, because they absolutely aren't. The moccasins are a great example of that. The laborers continue to be Native peoples, but they're working for white merchants. But slowly and surely, they become increasingly more and more of a minority until we get to the point that you mentioned today of about a 1% population. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
At about the time that Detroit is being settled in the French country of Illinois, Cahokia and Kaskaskia are being founded as well, and then St. Genevieve across the river. Historians of those places, Carl Eichberg and Margaret Kimball Brown and so forth, have noticed in trade what was in the 1970s a surprising amount of European goods in those settlements. But they also found ties with the Caribbean, with Haiti and Cuba and the like. And I wondered whether or not any goods, items, people from the Caribbean made their way all the way up the Mississippi, through the Great Lakes to Detroit.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Not that I have ever been able to find. And the example that I'm thinking of for the Illinois country settlements, you mentioned Pointe du Sable, the man who ends up owning the portage at Chicago. Yeah, is from the Caribbean somewhere, probably. I've not found any examples like that. Do I think that's because they aren't there? Probably not. I mean, odds are good. Most of these French families move through all of these settlements. So I think chances are very good that there are people with direct ties to the Caribbean who make their way to Detroit. I just haven't found them yet.
With farms established along the Detroit River for, I think, 12 to 15 miles on both sides, what role does agriculture play in the economy of Detroit?
Agriculture plays a huge role in the economy of Detroit, but it's a local one. They discover very quickly that due to the perishability of that produce, they can't send it too terribly far, especially when canoe routes and portages are uncertain. So the majority of the excess agricultural goods that Detroit exports go to settlements that are very nearby. So this is, it's not what Detroit is making its money on, for sure. Oh, yes, excuse me.
Yeah, the fashion you were talking about with the high-waisted dresses was right at the very early years of the 1800s. and they were wearing very thin garments and low-cut necklines.
Yes.
And later on, the clothing became much thicker with, you know, several layers and long sleeves.
Yes.
So I think that probably demonstrates that there was a change in the climate. And that changing climate over time made a difference to the fur trade. I mean, the very early French settlers did come during a very cold spell. And all the furs that they got, especially beaver and stuff, that would affect the ecology of the area and the, you know,
Certainly.
what the beavers, and that would affect the amount of food that the native populations had and their relations to each other. So how would that affect the Europeans versus the Native Americans?
So with regard to climate change, the Little Ice Age ended about 1800, so exactly the time that we're seeing these kinds of thinner fashions develop. Also new textiles coming onto the market, so that's part of the answer also. And as to the decline in the fur trade, certainly there can be some climate reasons for why it diminishes after 1820. It's also they've exhausted the supply locally, right? They have to keep moving further and further afield. Hudson's Bay Company to try to get a hold of that supply. So there certainly may be climate reasons. There are also environmental reasons why the fur trade in Detroit is no longer the major industry after 1820. So the effects that has on Europeans, well, they're forced into other kinds of economic ventures, and so when we're thinking about modern Detroit and its kind of rise and fall, economically speaking, this is actually a very old pattern for Detroit. Detroit has reinvented itself economically a number of times, including after 1820 when the fur trade no longer continues to be viable. And as for Native peoples, well, this is another reason why they become less visible in the city after Detroit's siege by Pontiac in 1763. So they too are moving westward and away from as these white settlers are coming in with the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. So yes, it's absolutely affecting who's in town.
As a direct descendant of the habitants that owned the battlefield for Bloody Run, I'm trying to find if anybody's got records of when they left and how they left. Was there any evidence of the British literally moving French out? Because I've seen a map in the Babby Museum in Windsor that showed 6 ribbon farms with my family name on them. And I'm not sure if any of those people went there willingly or not.
So this is a great question. What happens to the French of Detroit as time wears on? When the Americans come in, after 1796, Detroit burns to the ground in 1805. Just about everything was wiped out. And in the process of verifying land claims and trying to lay out the town to look, quote unquote, more Americanized. So for those of you who are familiar with downtown Detroit, Campus Martius Park, that very strange kind of semi-moon in the middle of all these rectilinear blocks, that was the one remnant of Woodward's plan to make Detroit laid out in repeating hexagons. And initially it sounded like a very fashionable, intriguing kind of idea. Locals fought him on it. Eventually, after one half of one hexagon was built, they abandoned the plan. So then they go back to rectilinear blocks. But in the process of verifying the land claims, trying to lay out the new city, yes, French, particularly French residents, British too, but especially French residents did get displaced. And that took a good 20, 25 years after Detroit burned down in 1805 before the new layout of the town was finally agreed upon and progress really resumed to try to build this community. So when the British come in, most French residents, I would say, remain in the community. After the Americans come in, many relocate to the south side, staying with the British Canada instead of being in the United States. They move to communities downriver, Frenchtown, et cetera, down by Monroe. So we see settlement coming up and down the river of French people after this point. As for French people being forcibly evicted, not that I have encountered, but let me ask Brian if he's ever come across that.
The British Commandant of Detroit did express some concern that French were moving out of the stockaded town itself and into the countryside, and the population of the town was becoming more Anglophone. And he was concerned because should there be another problem with the Indians, they were depending on the French for much of the intelligence about what was going on. He was afraid they'd lose their ears if too many people moved away, too many French moved away. But I don't know of them ever forcibly moving in.
In fact, when Lewis Cass had plans for extending the roads out of Detroit into the surrounding counties, a number of the French residents absolutely refused to have those roads pass through their property. So it was another way that the local French population in particular prevented this kind of change to the look of Detroit.
Could you relate, you're talking about the New York pound.
Mm-hmm.
How does that relate compared to dollars today?
Oh boy, that's going to be very tough. So the average colonist in about 1775 was making 25 New York pounds a year, as opposed to what is it now? About 50,000 a year. So the fur trade was about 4,000 times an annual colonist's income. So that would be what, 200 million? I have to think about where how many zeros are in that, but something like 200 million, I think. So which is rough, and it's not a good equivalent, but to give you a sense of the scale.
I just wondered if you had some sense of where those goods were going on to, because with the exception of your shopaholic dude, clearly they're going somewhere. And my other question was about the composition of that sort of white indigenous community. How many of them are Métis?
Great questions. So as for where the goods are going, do you mean once they arrive in Detroit and then they're sent further on? All over the place. Michilimackinac, Green Bay, Chicago, and then from Chicago, presumably down the Mississippi, and then who knows where. So I think we can assume they're going quite far afield. As for the Métis community, yes, absolutely central to Detroit. In fact, one of the scholars that Brian was alluding to, this cohort of us working on early Detroit, works on the Métis families and argues that they're really the ones who got Detroit off the ground. So there is a sizable Métis community. They are, at least in the period I'm studying, not referring to themselves as both native and French. Mostly, if they're in town, they're emphasizing their French identity, generally speaking. So not a category of people that is visible in the way it becomes later, but they're absolutely there. Yes?
I was really struck by the microscope that's in that estate auction as well. And I'm wondering if you can talk about any cultural institutions related to learning or knowledge, or groups of people doing
None.
that? Okay.
None. And this is the surprise. There's nothing in the way of a cultural institution in this period. They very quickly start to become developed into the early 19th century, but this is a bit early yet. So what he was doing with the microscope, the two globes, the collection of maps, the other scientific instruments, I have absolutely no idea. I can't imagine that he was planning to open his own shop further in the interior. I can't imagine that he would find a market for those things, but who knows? Yes?
Were the people mostly bilingual during that time period?
No, they were mostly French speakers. When the British came in, they expressed annoyance in all kinds of documents that the French were still speaking French and were tied to their religious customs, their cultural customs, etc. In fact, when Detroit burns in 1805, Part of the reason that the claims process drags on for so long is that it takes the U.S. government a while to realize that the claims commissioners need to be able to speak French. So they're trying to work through interpreters, and it was just a disaster. And the French-speaking residents were not comfortable speaking with these American newcomers. So it takes the American government a while to realize that actually it's not going to change in the short term, and we need to do something about that. But basically, it's francophone. It's francophone for a long time. As Irish and German immigrants start coming in the 1840s, then we see the francophone population becoming increasingly a minority. There was a French language newspaper even as late as the early 20th century, but mostly that was for new waves of francophone immigrants, not the existing populace. So certainly by the early 20th century, Detroit was no longer a francophone community. Okay, well, thank you very much. This was a pleasure.